Blast off, thank you. Well, I'm going to start us off just for the interest of time. Welcome, and thanks for joining this cross-sector session. We're really looking forward to seeing how this discussion develops. If you haven't already, say hi in the chat, type in a Duffy number. I had the initial thought of changing this to Winnie the Pooh characters, then I realized that they kind of represent more serious illness, so I decided that was a bad idea. But just to set the record straight, especially for Chris Kinkade, I'm a hybrid between a Tigger and a Pooh. And on that bad joke note, I'm going to jump in, and I think I have slide control. Maybe just trying to advance this over. Do I not have slide control yet? I don't think I do. All right, just turned on. Well, I will introduce myself as I get control of these slides, since this is only my third annual meeting. Oh, there we go. Oops, now it's just delayed off. This is my only third annual meeting. I'll introduce myself. My name is Chris Peter. I'm the research coordinator at Great Bay, and I am putting on my facilitator slash CTP hat, invisible hat for this portion right here. I know everyone's kind of sick of hearing this participation of tips, but just to keep things moving fastly and smoothly, we ask that people will, turn their webcams off and put themselves on mute for the most part. I mentioned in the second half, in the more collaborative brainstorming part, it would be nice to see faces and hear voices. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to just put them in the chat box whenever. We're going to answer a couple of them on the fly, and we're going to answer the rest of them as best we can afterwards. Lastly, I would mention if you were to go to the top middle of your screen and you can choose your camera choices, we recommend using View Active Cameras just to reduce the clutter. I also want to point out our participant list is broad. We have people that are registered across a great distribution of geography, and as well as sector. So we've had this conversation before, mostly in research and stewardship sectors, but it's awesome to kind of see this more generally across the research system. So I'm really looking to see how that adds to the discussion. Moving on, oops, I lose, oh, there we go. So what is this talk going to be about today? Well, we're going to focus on cross-near projects, multi-reserve projects, and we're defining that as at least 3 reserves or more. The more the merrier, that's kind of the theme here. More reserves, more sectors, more close local partners, the merrier. We'll touch upon some examples soon enough. I did want to mention some funding models, because we're not going to talk about that in great detail, but if you're interested, just to kind of stoke some fires, some current and past ways we've been funded is through internal pots of money, science collaborative, through national product, through other offices of NOAA, like the Office of Education, Ocean Acidification, even some pots outside, like LTERs. Kind of moving on, kind of struggling here, sorry with this. Oh, here we go, perfect. Kind of our session outline, we're going to break this into 2 parts. The first part will be highlighting 4 speakers that are going to talk about their projects and their experiences. And I always laugh when I see this picture on the top left with the TLP boxes. In the next session, we're going to do more of a collaborative brainstorming type part, and it's going to dive into the Padlet, which many of you already contributed to. We thank you for that. And we're going to explore one project in detail to kind of like highlight the process and even potentially move it forward. Clicking forward here. Speaking of forward, and I also want to mention that this session is a result of many people, a lot of people you see and some people that aren't here. But I do want to mention that it does cross over 3 sectors. We have people from OCM, from Science Collaborative, and I want to give a special shout out to Lynn, who really has spearheaded this process from the get-go. And before I hand it over to our first speaker, I do want to mention that these speakers are going to have some time for one question at the end. So please put some questions in the chat box. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kerstin.
Hello, everybody. Let's see if I can click and make it advance. Yes. So again, if if a question occurs to you while I'm speaking, go ahead and type it into the chat box and we'll pick one question to answer. So I just want to share with you a little bit about why I love Multiner projects. So I started in 2000 and for 15 years or so really focused on collecting data and stewarding resources at Elkhorn Slough. And then in 2014, my life changed forever when this guy, Kenny Raposa, invited me and Scott Lerberg and Eric Smith to participate in a what it keeps forwarding. Please. Sorry, we're having a little issue with the controls. To participate in a synthesis of marsh restoration across our reserves. And since that worked out very well at our 4 pilot sites, we invited these other people on, and before we knew it, had this synthesis across 15 reserves that now it's not forwarding. Worked great when we tested it. There we go. And what I want to share sort of some of what I love about these Multiner projects from having done them. One thing is that they're grassroots. This is not somehow coming down from above with orders how to do things, but is really driven by what's going on the ground on the reserve. So Kenny worried about this tall alterniflora replacing his patents adjacent to the upland boundary, me worrying about my marshes converting to mudflats, they're drowning. That's what led us to be interested in marsh resilience for the synthesis, and then later for the thin layer sediment addition project to see if we couldn't fix this across the reserves. Likewise, in Rhode Island and in California, we had a ton of crab burrows, and that led to a synthesis of crabs across the NERRs. These projects that I've been involved with were led by SCs and RCs and focused on sentinel site data, but I really want to be clear, as Chris also mentioned, that any sector could lead one of these projects. Because I think they're really about forming communities of practice, and that can be any type of practice. Another Multiner project that I've been involved with is the Native Olympia Oyster Collaborative on the West Coast, and restoration practitioners are one big community of practice involved in that project. As well as educators, we developed curriculum and resources for teaching about oysters, like this cute puppet that you need at your reserve of oyster anatomy. These multi-reserve projects give us the ability to create a snapshot of the state of the nation's estuaries, in this case, marsh resilience, but again, this could just as well be an educational synthesis, like how many middle schoolers in your region make it out to the estuary, make it outdoors at all as a part of their school, and comparing that among regions, for instance. The reserves can be used as replicates. That's what's great about our network, is that we can test hypotheses using each reserve as a replicate. In this case, we were looking at the relative effects of crabs versus sea level rise as measured by elevation across 15 different reserves and forming some generalities from that. But again, you could test a hypothesis about what sort of outreach tool is better, a hands-on sea level rise model versus a web toolkit for sea level rise, and test both across a bunch of reserves, see which is better and how that varies among regions. I think a really valuable output of these projects is that they raise our profile as the NERRs to a bunch of different audiences. So scientists recognize the NERRs from these co-authored publications that have a bunch of you on the call on as authors. I think NOAA takes notice of what we're doing and has highlighted a bunch of these projects on their web pages. We get local attention, the papers from these big projects, and, you know, in interesting places all over. And because a lot of the projects involve not just publications, but creating tools, those tools then are adopted elsewhere, such as British Columbia now using our Mars tool to assess their estuaries. So these multi-NERR projects have really been the greatest joy in my career since 2014, and I think they've really been very powerful for the NERR system as a whole. That's my toast to multi-NERR projects, and I'm glad to take a question if there is one. I see the puppet question. Is there an actual question? All right, then.
Kirstin,
yeah.
I got a question for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
How do you decide what project to kind of throw your energy into? How do you know what's going to be a good, you know, cross-NERR topic to pursue?
I mean, I think that's where the grassroots part is really important for both Kenny and me. We pursue the projects that we're passionate about. We're interested in crabs. We love now wildlife camera trapping is the next one we're generating, or the one that's launching January, historical ecology. I love looking at old T-sheets and maps. I think I really have gone with what sparks joy for me, and not necessarily so much on which one is the highest priority for the NERR system, because there will be somebody else. You know, decomposition rates are super important. I'm not a biogeochemist though, so I'm not going to lead that project, but I'll sign up to join that one. I think that's how it makes sense, is if we each lead the projects that spark joy for us and assume someone else with expertise will lead a project in the other areas. All right, so now I would like to pass this on. Is it back to Kristin?
Yes.
Definitely.
Thanks, Kerstin. I love the photo, and I'm actually wearing that same shirt because I'm state partner. We don't have that much money for more than one shirt. So I'm actually wearing my King Cressman hat now because unfortunately she's dealing with the after effects of Hurricane Zeta. And I thought it might be appropriate to put a weather station graph just showing the precipitation ramp up to a couple inches and the wind ramp up to almost 50 miles per hour. I converted this beforehand into meters per second. But she's okay. I've been texting her back and forth. She doesn't have any power and Wi-Fi. So I'm going to do my best to kind of explain this project, but just know I'm not really too much engaged in this project. And perfect, animation worked. So the title of her project is Mars Surface Tracking Seal Change, Developing Tools and Visualizations for NERRS Sentinel Site Data. And her project focused on SET, surface elevation tables, and this diagram on the right kind of just shows the process in a great way, from collecting the data in the field to wrangling it to kind of formatting it to output. Then you could transform it into a communication product or an analysis, or have it ingested into a larger database. And I think she wanted to cover two different areas here. One area was tips for collaboration. And this one really speaks to me, plan for multiple levels of engagement, which I think is critical, especially when you have a large project team with a lot of people and a lot of reserves. And I was actually an advisor on this project in one level of engagement. So I really appreciated different levels of commitment that really clearly spelled out like how much time you needed to put into it and what the workload is. And that kind of speaks to our second bullet. And the last three bullets are kind of like tied into what Woody and that space guy are saying. I've never actually seen this movie, but I hear it's really good. It's all about feedback. And that's what these bullets are. So for example, if somebody was to miss a call or a webinar or a meeting, you can follow up with them individually, get their feedback, see how, and then kind of show them how that feedback kind of shapes a project. Because really these projects, these collaborative projects are shaped quite a bit by feedback from the get-go to the end. Secondly, she wanted to kind of touch base on technical tips. And the first two here, if you have time, you can type into this little link here, kind of brings you to this cartoon. It gets to this old fieldwork adage that I've been taught, that fieldwork takes twice as long and you get half the work done. And the same applies with data formatting or wrangling, and it's maybe even amplified. And I kind of found that in the project I'm going to highlight next as well. Also, I did want to mention this picture on the right that shows this like 2-foot Post-it note that she put it on the office of her wall for the duration of this project, just to make sure she kept their the eyes on the prize. What's the most important steps for the end user, so you don't stray too far, because there's a lot of tempting rabbit holes to explore. So we just kind of like got to stick to the main goals first and then explore it later. And lastly, always be on the lookout for next steps. And this is a great segue into the next talk, because I had some shared next steps. But before I jump into that, I wanted to say that we're going to take a question, and Kristin Evans from Mission-Aransas, the education coordinator there, who's actually involved in this project as well, is going to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah, and maybe Kristin, if you wouldn't mind, it'd be great to hear just about your role in the project. And I know Kim had kind of an outreach team, and I was wondering just if you could explain a little bit about what that looked like and how it worked.
Absolutely. So this was an interesting project to be involved with. I have to openly admit to hundreds of ears on the call that I was not intimately familiar with sets. I'd worked with our stewardship coordinator and so knew a little bit about it, but I kind of stepped in a little bit blindly to this project because there was an interest in really involving all of the sectors and all of the sectors equally. And I was really interested in that because the ECs and the CTPs, which came together in the outreach part of this collaborative, sometimes are given product at the end to utilize because it's derived and created for another end user. In this case, you might have assumed that it was just for the research coordinators, but in fact, from the very beginning, the ECs and the CTPs were involved in the conversation. The hard work of looking at how we can pull the data together and put it into a visualization, while that was going to be really important for stewardship coordinators and research coordinators, they realized while they were putting the work into it, they might as well think about all of the other end users that need the visualized data to be able to interpret and showcase this information to their own users. And so in that vein, the education coordinator representative, which was me, but there were quite a few of us kind of hidden in the marshes, so to speak, providing feedback from each of the collaborator sites. There were voices kind of coming from the peanut gallery, so to speak, to say, hey, we need this, or this is what it should look like if it's being outreached to this particular audience. We understand that it might need to look like X for your audience, but it needs to look like Y for our audience. And so there was a lot of active listening and thoughtful consideration of, one, as Chris was saying, what is the end project we need to achieve in this year? And then how can we achieve as much as we can with products that will be useful for several end users? So I really appreciated having a voice at the table from the beginning and having a lot of collaboration and negotiation of what we could accomplish over the course of the year. And then as ECs, we had to think about what do we do with this information to move it forward, recognizing it was not going to be a complete product. It was never designed to be a complete project, but we had to pick it up from there and integrate it into how we could use it. And so that active work is taking place right now. And I'll give out a shout out to Avery because she's helping to champion some of those on behalf of the ECs. So that was kind of what our role was and how we kind of played a part at the table for these conversations in this collaborative project.
Great, thanks, Kristin. And actually, I forgot to mention one thing, and that was actually prompted by the question in the chat box, is that this project was kind of sparked by an RC-SC joint session, and also a regional tote workshop or session by a lot of ECs that have just this similar need. So it's great to see this project move forward. And with that, I'm going to segue into the next. Uh-oh, did I do that?
No, that was me. Sorry, Chris.
It's okay. Some meeting gremlins here. Into the next project, which I'm a little bit more familiar with, and it's a similar project as Kim's Kinkade project. And this one involved 4 reserves in England and a colleague from the University of New Hampshire. Great project team. And our focus was a synthesis of New England salt marshes, and it involved 8 marshes over 8 years of data, several hundred quadrats and species, and a shit ton of data points, pardon my French. And let's kind of highlight like a key summary here. The marshes are changing in New England collectively. And particularly in the low marsh, we're losing our low good grass, unfortunately, and it's being replaced by non-living cover, dead, water, and bare. And it's particularly even highlighted in southern New England. And I was going to put up some statistics or a graph, but I think this time series from Kinkade in Narragansett just speaks volumes of a plot in the low marsh going from vegetated to the opposite, as Kerstin was mentioning in her talk, just 5 short years. And if you're interested more in this project, there's a website link. I'll put in the chat so I can write it all down. And we have a final report. We have guides up to you guys if you want to do the soup to nuts of the different reserve or region. We have a recorded webinar. You can actually hear me talk about it, which is probably too much. You can also hear Kim talk about her project, because she was in that webinar as well, and Chris. So this regional effort led to a national effort. Basically, we went from 4 reserves in New England to 21 reserves across the country. And I'm excited and equally terrified when this starts up in February. This went from a 1-year project to a 3-year project. And so we're scaling up, we're also speeding up. So we're going to take a lot of the technical approach and expertise from the Setter project that I talked about with Kim was leading, Kristin was mentioning, and use that to really deal with all the data we're going to get, 21 reserves. So how, on a personal note, how did I go from 2 years ago being at UNH to being part of so many multi-reserve projects just 2 years later? Well, it's kind of a funny story. When I was at UNH, I actually wrote a proposal for the Science Collaborative, switched jobs, got hired at Great Bay, and then it was awarded. I definitely got to hit the ground running. And these Catalyst grants, this project I'm talking about, Kim's, were both going at the same time, and they really sparked this larger effort. We had the technical approach. We built off of that. We built off the collaborative process. We combined project teams, and we had some shared next steps. So these grants are actually designed to catalyze larger projects, and they really helped in my instance. The other very helpful thing was this meeting last year, this joint RC-SC meeting last year, spearheaded by Kerstin. I thought it was highly invaluable. It really kind of jump-started the proposal process. Despite like seeing Kyle in the background on his phone, Carl's like jotting down notes really profusely, and Kenny maybe even napping there. And I'm sure I'm off to the side with another flight of beer. But this was very productive. We got tons of feedback. We refined our research process, questions, and our process. We added a ton of team members, and we really got to cater this proposal and project to our primary end user, which is us. And I'm going to leave it at that. I guess I'll facilitate if we have any time for questions. I'm scanning right now. I'll be happy to answer.
I have one question for you, Chris, if you don't mind. Kind of, I mean, I know both of these projects have got lots of enthusiasm within the reserve system and lots of ways that they can be applied. I was wondering if you think about kind of another tier of users, just outside the reserve system, who would that be? Who would be the next folks that could be, in line to use this work?
Yeah, another group of end users. That's a great question, Lynn. I kind of want to start inside the reserve system, because we just had a SAM SAV session, and I think it'd be interesting. We're going through the same type of talking and process about what do we do with this data? What do we collect, and how does it get standardized and analyzed and visualized? So I think this could this SAV conversation can build off of the Marsh conversation. Also, there's a bunch of outside organizations that collect Marsh data as well, USGS, MPS. So they can utilize this process also, and it can be transferred to other habitats, like I said. And I think just for the interest of time, I'm going to kick it over to Jen to talk about TLP.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Going to see if I have control here, although I'm a little nervous because it seems like there's a bit of a delay. So oh, it says I have control. Let's see. There we go. Perfect. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the TLP project, we call it. It has this long title. We call it the TLP project, and I was the collaborative lead on that. And it examined the effectiveness of thin layer sediment placement as a climate adaptation strategy at 8 NERR sites across the nation. And as you could see them here in this map. And it was based on the need to test this adaptation strategy in more regions with different plant communities and elevations, as the majority of past studies are from the Southeast US. So this was a pretty large, complex project, and these were just, yeah, most of the core folks involved. So there were essentially 3 tiers of end users, 2 of which were engaged regularly. So the project team, which included staff from the 8 reserves, primarily folks in the research and stewardship sectors, and then the other folks you see listed there. And then we also had an advisory committee, which was comprised of 10 stakeholders from across the country. And we really wanted to ensure that the project benefited from a variety of perspectives and areas of expertise beyond the NERRs. And then there was this much broader set of end users, probably hundreds, from restoration practitioners to wetland managers to permitting and funding agencies to dredging coordinators. And they were involved really at the formative stage. So when we were doing needs assessment and proposal development, and at the final stages where they tuned into the webinar and received the products, etc. So lots of involvement, which was great. So since we know that the NERRs are ideal platforms for syntheses, this project involved this coordinated replicated field experiment at these 8 reserves, and coordinated and consistent monitoring across these diverse systems. And there was also a complementary greenhouse experiment that took a closer look at different sediment types. So again, there was a lot to this. And there was a lot of guidance developed from this. It's still really impressive to me how much was developed in such a short time. We had did a literature review. There's case studies, permitting guidelines, monitoring guidelines, this consensus statement, which this was the first time I've worked on a consensus statement. So there are 25 signatories from diverse organizations across the country on this consensus statement, and it summarizes the state of knowledge and recommendations to support future work. And consensus statements are no joke. And it's funny, as we were working on it, took my dog to the vet, and she was telling me about these different medications that maybe he should go on for his allergies or whatever. She's like, well, the latest consensus statement I read says this, and you know how long those take, like years. And to get that many vets to sign on to it. And so she's going on and on about consensus statement. I said, wow, I'm really impressed that we got this done in basically less than 2 years. So a lot of coordination, a lot of collaboration. And just this last slide, just a couple lessons learned. I think they were covered well in previous presentations. I think the one slide that Kim provided about sort of tips for collaborating was great. I will say, though, that I was slightly intimidated coming into this project because there were so many people involved. There's so many moving parts. It was pretty complex, but I will say these are only 4 of the team members, but Kerstin and Kenny were essentially co-PIs, I would say, and they were phenomenal. So they kind of made it easier for me. It was just a great team overall. And I think it was because we talked a lot and we really clarified what everybody's role was, how we would communicate, how we would make decisions. We also had this sort of team or collaborative charter for the advisory committee. And again, roles and responsibilities, expectations for their participation, explaining how decisions would be made. And we also did a ton of work up front. So we did a needs assessment at the pre-proposal stage and the full proposal stage, interviewed 22 key end users to shape the development of the pre-proposal. Then Elkhorn and it's only it's Thursday, right? Not Friday yet. Usually I start slipping up on words on Fridays. Elkhorn, Slough, NERR used capacity building funds to do a more involved needs assessment that involved an electronic survey and additional interviews. And so a lot was done right up front to determine the needs and who needed this information. And what else did I want to say about that? The only last thing I'll say in the few seconds I have remaining is that really research and monitoring were really the only sectors involved in this particular project, which when we're always thinking about how to make these as cross-sectoral as possible, which I think is really important, but sometimes it's hard. And I think back to previous proposals that we submitted, different teams submitted, and we tried to, from the very beginning, incorporate education and training, and it was essentially too much. They're like, you're trying to do too much. And so it's finding that balance between, yes, we want to do it wherever it's appropriate and wherever it's possible, and think about it right from the beginning. But sometimes I think it's just finding that balance of over committing of all the things you're going to do in like a 2-year period, and what's actually realistic and what the end users want and need. So anyway, I'll stop there and turn it over to Kirstin.